Good morning. How's everybody? Refreshed, I hope. We had a refreshed break. You guys are in for a real treat. You have two of my favorite presenters at the conference here. One of my favorite people, Amanda Wander, very humble, but accomplished a lot in her career so far. She ran the Big Bend COC, and now she's working as the Homeless Team Director for Florida Housing Coalition. And then you have Gaither Stevens, who, he's trying to revamp what Ian DeJong did with the VX for that. He does consulting with a lot of continuums around the nation. And he's, one of the coolest things he's doing right now, a lot of data consultation, but one of the coolest things he's doing is trying to find a new instrument that's more equitable to determine vulnerability for persons. So without further ado, I want to turn it over to Gaither.
All right, so I like to go gingerly up these microphones because I don't want to blast anyone out. First, I want to let everybody know that feel free to be relaxed. If you want to come in and out, get refreshments, snacks, you got to be on your phone or laptop, that's all fine. Sometimes it can be a little stuffy at these places, so feel free to relax and hopefully we enjoy ourselves. I did ask for a bigger room, but I think we'll be okay if people are comfortable with each other. So I do want to say thank you to Manny and Amanda, and just to say thank you for allowing me to come up here and hopefully show you some cool stuff and maybe talk about some of the things that I'm excited about, which specifically has to do with a lot of work in homelessness across the United States. So the agenda of what we're going to cover, and please, anytime I need to speak up or talk quieter or leave, just let me know. So we're going to do an introduction. We're going to cover organizational processes and foundational data visualization, equity, diversion, and inclusion, solutions, and collaborations. So this is just kind of a place where I like to stop and just say hello and let you know that I'm a fellow Floridian now. I'm from Charlotte County, Florida. I live down in Punta Gorda, and I really like the fact that we can come to these conferences in Orlando because it's not that bad a drive and it's sunny. I was in Minneapolis a couple of months ago, and Orlando's a lot better. I love Minneapolis. If anybody's from Minneapolis, but it's about 20 degrees below zero. This is a lot better. So a little bit about me. I actually grew up in Indiana. I started out in Marion, Muncie, and Fort Wayne, and I eventually moved down to Kentucky and Ohio to the Cincinnati area before I went down to Port Charlotte and Punta Gorda. So, make sure I get that up there. So I went to Purdue University, Indiana Wesleyan, and Boston University, and this is a slide. I like to just kind of show this to people because I wasn't sure. Sometimes when you transfer slides, things change. But one of the things I like to do is data visualization. And this is just a situation I like to say, hey, here's a slide that would be pretty typical at any kind of presentation you might do. But I always like to add, if you can, just add a little bit of visual aid. For me, I kind of have a different way of learning sometimes. Sometimes I learn through reading, sometimes it's visual, sometimes it's through audio. But sometimes just adding a little bit extra visual really just makes a presentation pop and will help you kind of stick things in your brain. So I'd recommend just throwing up a little graphic or something, and we're going to see lots of those during my presentation. I'm very much a book with pictures kind of person, with some words too. So my professional history, I actually did 18 years in radio. I was a general manager, I was a regional manager, and then after that I went into social services. I got hired as a data analyst at a homeless coalition down in Charlotte County, Florida. I did that for just about a year before I became the Chief Technology Officer, and I did that for about 4 years before launching my own company. And then I work with about 50 organizations across the country now. I do data dashboards for Orlando, San Diego, Flint, Detroit, Dallas, Charlotte, North Carolina, about 50 different organizations. One of the things I'm finishing up right now is a racial equity dashboard for Chattanooga, Tennessee. I'm also working on a learning management system for Alabama and Florida for their HMIS, which is a homeless management information system. So how people kind of track and services to clients experiencing homelessness. I build and work on an LMS so people can train and learn how to use that. And then the last thing I'm working on is a replacement to what's called the VI SPDAT. It's a vulnerability tool used to triage people for services in the country. And I'll cover a little bit more about that later. So normally when I speak, I tend to talk to people that are specifically in homeless services. So we have in homeless services something called a continuum of care. It's kind of like a United Way for a community. It can bring in money from the federal government, sometimes local partners, state partners as well, and then they can distribute that back out to agencies or to people so that they can hopefully get out of homelessness or prevent homelessness. That's normally what I do. Today is going to be, I wanted to make it a little more kind of available to everybody because maybe not everybody's in that specific niche. So I just kind of wanted to talk about things that I've learned over the course of the last 20 years that have helped me work well in the different organizations that I've ended up going into. Sometimes completely different from what I've done before. I may have waited tables and then I went into radio and then I went into data and then I own my own company. You never know where life might take you. But one of the things I like to say is if your foundation has a crack in it, then your house is likely to fall over at some point. A lot of organizations can become more efficient just by getting the basics right. So this is the first thing I do. When I come into an organization, I am like a deer in the headlights, and I don't know what to do a lot of times. Even communities, sometimes I'm like that. So the first thing I try to do is just like kind of stick my head down and just learn what's going on. So I try to examine basic business practices. I understand the basic business practices. I get the fundamentals right first. I don't try to expand anything out. I try to make sure we're getting the nuts and bolts of the business correct. And then once that's done, you can improve basic business practices, and then you can expand the business and repeat. This is an iterative process. It's something that can be done over and over to improve basically any organization. So when I first started on the radio, I was hired as an operations manager. I had literally never been in a radio station in my life. I was trying to hire in for a free position doing DJing Saturday nights, and they were like, how about an operations manager job, full-time? I said, why not? So I did that, and within less than a year, I was general manager, and we went from $7,000 a month to about $18,000 a month, and we went to number one, or not number one, but we went up in the ratings, and we sold the station for a big profit. And a lot of that, honestly, was me coming in and admitting I did not know how to run a radio station, and then sitting there and finding out how to run a radio station. And a lot of it, honestly, was just some of the basics. Just making sure that things aired at the right time, the right programs aired. We didn't air the same spot twice, back to back, just sloppy things. And I think a lot of times in businesses, we get caught up with some of the big picture things. We forget that there are little things in businesses that we need to get right first, and then we can expand. And I know a lot of times that's because we wear too many hats, but if you're not getting your nuts and bolts in your day-to-day right, that's just gonna exponentially hinder your business later on. So it's great to expand, but make sure you're doing the day-to-day business and you're efficient and things are going well and you're improving and you have ways to measure your effectiveness, some of these basic components. And then I kind of did the same thing when I went to work for a continuum of care. The data was a mess, the system was a mess, we had data quality scores that were all Fs. I mean, that just means obviously they're really bad. And within the few years I was there, we went to straight A's for our data quality. Our system performance measures improved. Everything just went, from kind of the dumps up to where they should have been. And it really wasn't anything fancy. It was just getting those day-to-day things right, examining kind of some of the processes that people took for granted, improving some of the efficiencies, reducing time on projects, just a lot of little things. And sometimes it's just asking questions and maybe not being scared to appear dumb. Because it's like, oh, okay, we have to turn in this form. Okay, this form gets to a certain place. How does it get there? Well, it gets there. Okay, but is it email? Is it walked there? Is it driven there? Is it mail, fax? Sometimes just understanding the chain of command and the chain of property can really help you improve efficiency, because maybe that form doesn't need to go to 5 departments. Maybe that form doesn't need to be walked over or driven to Tallahassee or whatever. So sometimes just really digging down and understanding how the business works helps you improve it. So one of the things that helped me a lot when I first started out is I started visiting the other locations. I didn't just make phone calls, and I'm all about virtual meetings. I think all that stuff's great, but I think when you're trying to understand a business, really need to walk in the door. You really need to talk to people. You need to talk to them about pain points. You don't just want to talk necessarily to the owner or to the CEO. You also want to see how the processes work on the ground floor. You know, walk through the different buildings, ask questions, meet different people. It's amazing the processes you can learn just from talking to the people that actually do them. So that's what I did. I went to every agency, every person I could think of just to kind of say, hey, how do you do this? How does this work? And it was incredible. And then I kind of thought about that on a bigger scale. And I thought, you know, I've got these people that are helping me now and teaching me things. And I would kind of find one person per agency that could kind of be my liaison. And I thought, why couldn't I expand this? So I started realizing that there were other communities across the country doing what I do and other people. And so I built a network of close to 1,000 people now. And it's a Slack group, it's just a real-time chat online, but every day we're in there helping each other, whether it be with funding, whether it be with personnel or forms, documents, all kinds of things. Even sometimes it's just support. Sometimes we just talk and we just share funny pictures, but it's this network that has really become, I think, a real asset to our industry and our field, and I'm hoping it's just going to keep growing. But it was that kind of, I don't want to say out of the box, because it wasn't anything like drastically crazy. It was just people coming together and realizing that we can all help each other. And I think we can do that on multiple levels, on lower levels, middle levels, high levels, and you know, and we can kind of go through the levels and reach over them. But the point is that don't be afraid to ask for help, and don't be afraid to ask questions, because that's really how you're going to learn. So I like to tell this story because it's kind of funny. Communities across the country, the way that we kind of assess how many people are experiencing homelessness, we go out and we survey them. So we literally go out with a lot of times paper surveys or digital tablets, and then we go and ask questions. And that starts out with gender and things that are pretty standard on age and all that kind of stuff. And then it delves into different things like disability, and it goes a little kind of deeper in some of the questioning. But you really get a chance to go out and meet and talk to people. And that's how every year the United States figures out how many people we have homeless at any given time or experiencing homelessness. So it's a very hands-on, boots on the ground kind of a process. And I'd recommend anybody doing it if you get the chance, because all the communities do it every year, usually around January. But we had one where it was really interesting. I had a friend of mine that was conducting one of the surveys, and he asked one of the people experiencing homelessness, he walks up and he says, hey, he goes, what's your name? And the guy says, it's Cowboy. He goes, oh, well, it's a cool name. So he writes Cowboy's name down, and he begins asking Cowboy all these questions, and age and disability and all these different things. And then he's like, is anybody staying with you here in the camp? Because this is just a tent in the woods. This isn't anything fancy. And he's like, yeah, my son's in the tent. And so Mike's asking more questions. How old's your son? He's 10 years old. Can he come out? Can I meet your son? Oh no, he's got bad hips. He's going to stay in the tent. And so we're like, okay, we don't want to be intrusive or anything. So eventually, Mike is still asking these questions. This is the first time Mike had ever been out talking to anybody that experienced homelessness. This was, Mike's mind was blown away, but he was taking the survey very seriously, asking these questions, and he's making sure he's getting them all right. And then he looks over and he sees this. And he asks about the son. Asking questions. And one of the things that was interesting is this is Cowboy. The guy we're talking to is Cowboy. His son's name is Quarterback. And we're like, wow, that's pretty cool. And, for a kid, that's a neat name, right? Quarterback. And so Mike is kind of still asking these questions. He starts getting kind of chatty. He's asking all the sort of questions. He's like, oh, hey, Cowboy. He's like, I see you got a cage here. It looks like you got maybe a dog or something. He's like, yeah, I got a dog. And he's like, oh, well, what's your dog's name? And he goes, oh, it's Quarterback. And so the thing was, Quarterback was his son to him. Quarterback was this man's 10-year-old son that was in the tent with bad hips. But the thing was, Cowboy wouldn't go into housing because he couldn't take Quarterback with him. And that happens a lot of times when we don't necessarily realize that, these are people that we're working with and talking with and seeing every day, and they have preferences, and they have animals that they love and families, and I don't know, and really when you kind of just get the chance to talk to people, again, you connect on a whole different level. So even if it's just, getting to know your clients or getting to know the people you work with, whether it be your colleagues or the people that you're working to help, it's good to just talk talk to them and get to know them, because it's amazing some of the stories that you might end up having. But I'll tell you where I was going with this originally was bad data, because Mike was collecting this data on Quarterback, who was a 10-year-old dog, and didn't need to be in our system. So sometimes you have bad data when you don't necessarily train people or you don't ask all the questions that you need to ask. Fortunately, Mike kept asking questions and he got to good data. So by having accurate data, you can examine efficiency, you can identify areas for improvement, and measure effectiveness. Without accurate data, your organization is always in the dark and doesn't know which direction to go because the data is a hindrance, not a help. Once you have accurate data, look for ways to measure, improve, and present the data as information to your stakeholders. Analyze your data to improve your organization. It's really important that you think about at your organization, and honestly, even in your daily life, just what are you measuring? How do you know that you're doing what you should be doing? How do you know that you're getting better at what you're doing? And maybe you just like the way things are, that's okay, but efficiency can be very helpful. If you can do something in 4 hours, it used to take you 8, you got 4 hours to deal with and to work with and to have other things to do, whether it's reading a book or whatever. So that's why efficiency and measuring and making improvements can be so important for an organization. Okay, so this is kind of like my bread and butter. I won't go through like every slide a ton, but this is where I really start to get kind of interested in data, because for me, sometimes I have a hard time understanding or learning material when it's just written down or it's just numbers on a chart or a table, especially if it's like a 20-page long thing and it's got multiple dates, and then I'm like, I don't know, it gets to be a bit much for me. So I like to take things and I like to visualize them. So what you see on the screen now is a simple visualization of active clients. So these are people that would have been served in a system that was meant to prevent homelessness. And what you see is a visualization that, is that a point on? Well, so what you'll see is this kind of line. You see the line over there, and what's cool is you can see trends. You can see when things are increasing, when things are decreasing. You can also hover over to find out specific months, like what was happening during December of 21, what was happening during March. And so it's not so much important what the data I'm showing you is, it's the fact that I've taken data and then visualized it. It makes it so much faster to be able to process the information and to see areas that might be concerning, that I just highly recommend any chance you get, visualize your data, because you're just gonna see things that pop out at you so much faster than any other way before. So what we're seeing here, this is another visualization. It's very similar. The one before would have shown all people. This one shows just people experiencing homelessness. Again, it's very handy to be able to see that we have kind of an increase going on towards the middle, and there's a decrease at the end. Things like this are great for allowing you to hone in on areas that you need to kind of check out in your system. Something else we have when we serve people that are experiencing homelessness, there's something called chronic homelessness. That's if someone's been homeless for more than a year and then also has a disability. There's some other slight variations on that, but that's the crux of it. And this is again showing that kind of that visualization of that. So seeing how many people, and it's also good because, even though the visualizations, they might look similar as far as their scale, by hovering, you can see that one might be 7,000, one might be 900. So it's always good, I think, when you're doing visualizations to add guides and tips and things that kind of will help the person as they're looking through the data kind of understand it and maybe, be able to add some context and give them further information if they need it. Veterans are obviously something that we work really hard on across the country to work with, make sure there's no veterans experiencing homelessness. So that's another demographic that we target quite heavily. And obviously children. I don't have it on here, but something also that I think we're working with a lot right now are the unaccompanied youth, which is 18 to 24. It's a big target vulnerable population. So this is a visualization I like to show because this is something, so when we have our homeless system, people enter and exit. We call them entry exits, and it's basically they come into the program or to maybe an agency, they start getting help, and then they go to housing or they go somewhere else maybe. But this is what's known as an inflow outflow chart. So the red are people entering the system, and then blue are people exiting the system. And what's really cool about this is you can start to see, are they following each other? Are there spikes? Are there differences? This looks really cool in some communities with the pandemic. I mean, it's some really stark contrasts. But you can also see things like maybe when shelters open back up, or different kind of things on the ground. Maybe they had a bunch of people in hotels and different things. So it's really cool to be able to see this stuff almost happen just visually. You don't have to look up you don't have to look up May, and then you don't have to look up the next month, and the next month, and the next month. You can have all of this in one visualization, and then you can just like draw all that information in so fast. This one's a little crazy. This is a Sankey chart. So when people exit the homeless system, they will have a couple of, or actually this measures or shows you 3 different measurements. It'll show you where they came from, so the living situation when they enrolled in the project, the type of project they were in, and then where they went. So what you would hope to see here is the red side is homelessness. So you're hoping to see at the other side of the far right more green or blue or other colors than red. But this is kind of a complicated chart, but it's a really handy way for organizations to see system flow as of last exit for the homeless system. And it's one of those things, again, just kind of being creative with visualizations and just finding new ways to see something. And sometimes it might be changing it from a bar chart to a graph to a Sankey chart or whatever, but sometimes just changing that visualization or looking at that data from a different angle can make all the difference. So when you bring it all together, it can look like this, which is a data dashboard. So a data dashboard could be internal only, it could be on your public-facing website, but the point is the data's there and the data's out there. The public can see it, your stakeholders can see it. Having the data out there is incredible. I cannot tell you how much in our community just having data on our website made us like the data leader in the community. And people started asking us to work on data projects and do data things. And it's like, we're not doing anything crazy, we're just taking the data and making it so that it's digestible. We tried to use natural language, we tried to make it look decent design and style. We just wanted it to look good so that people can just go, wow, I think I understand what this means. And again, there's tooltips, there's instructions. The point is we really want to get this information into the hands of the people so that people can use it. Okay, so this is something that I've been working on more recently, and it means a lot to me. And this is, I think, a really good graphic, and there are lots of graphics that show things similar to this. But I think this is kind of the best one, because you see what reality is, you see what equality looks like, and then you see what equity looks like, and then you see what liberation looks like. And I don't know what liberation looks like, to be honest. That may be too far down the road for me to even picture. I mean, I dream of it, but right now I think we're doing the best we can trying to get from, reality to equity. I think we're still stuck in equality sometimes. And these are definitions that, these are from my own kind of understanding that I'm still working on. So I guarantee they're lacking, but sometimes I think it's good just to kind of spell things out simply so that maybe maybe there's another person in the room like me that went, oh, I didn't know that, so I can pass this information on. So equality is everyone gets an equal share regardless of past or current circumstances. Most people think that sounds all right at first. But equity is acknowledging that some people have not been treated equally in the past or present, and therefore, to make things equal, past and present circumstances are also taken into consideration. So it's kind of like if we're all in a group of people, maybe there's like 10 of us or something, and I don't know, we order some pizzas, and then we send out Jeff to get us some drinks. We're like, man, we don't need drinks for our pizza. We send Jeff out. Well, while Jeff's out, we eat like almost all the pizza, right? Like, we're like, man, we really like pizza. We're eating all this pizza. So then Jeff comes, and there's 10 of us total. Maybe we got 10 slices of pizza, and we're like, oh, well, Jeff's back. Everybody gets one slice of pizza because that's fair. Okay, see, that's equality, and that's not right, because we sent Jeff out on a mission, and Jeff was doing other stuff, and Jeff brought us back great things, and yet we're like almost punishing Jeff. We're not taking into account that he hasn't been there all this time eating all this pizza with us, and now we're just like, oh no, but you get your one slice. So that's not really right. You can't just be like, no, this moment right now is the only reality. We're going to ignore everything else. That's not how life works, or at least it shouldn't. Inclusion is having a voice and being able to be part of something in order to help shape it. And then diversity is ensuring that all parties are represented at the table. I'm still learning these, honestly. There are things that may seem, I think, simple on the surface, but the more you understand how it affects people and the way the systems work, there's always more to understand, and there are always layers to kind of scratch off. So I just encourage you to keep learning, hopefully like I am, and we can keep making a difference. So Manny had mentioned this. There's something, I don't know if everybody here in the room knows about this, but when someone enters into a homeless system, they are triaged, just like you would be at a hospital. So if a guy shows up with a gunshot wound and a guy shows up with a headache, just because the guy with the headache was there first, he doesn't get treated first. The guy with the gunshot gets treated first. I think that makes sense to everybody. So the homeless system works very similarly. We have limited resources, shocking nobody. And by having limited resources, we have to also ration our services. And to do that, we prioritize people based on their need. One of the ways of doing that is something called the VI SPDAT, which I don't remember off the top of my head. It's like Vulnerability Index, Service Prioritization, Decision, and Assistance Tool. So it's something that's generally given to people when they show up for homeless assistance, and it has some questions on it that are maybe not the most sensitive. And I'm not going to get the verbatim right off the top of my head, but have you been raped? Have you been in prison or jail? It's very kind of like, some people would say the questions can be re-traumatizing, but one of the problems is that many of the questions, what we find out is that marginalized people are underrepresented and their vulnerability isn't properly represented when taking the survey. So imagine somebody, and this analogy was given to me by somebody out in New Zealand that's working on a replacement for the VI SPDAT. They said, you have somebody in front of you with their child, and they're trying to get services, maybe they want help for whatever, maybe it's that they're trying to go to the food pantry or rental assistance, whatever it might be, and you ask them about their, if they've been in prison or jail, and they've got like a kid on their knee. And it's like, really? Who's going to answer that question honestly? Because most people are going to be worried that kid's going to get taken away, because you're already there asking for help. And now it's like, yeah, I'm going to be honest and tell you that, whatever. I mean, I don't think most people would be honest in a situation like that. And so what we're finding is the tool is seriously flawed, and we're looking for replacements for it around the country. But the big problem is there are basically 350 organizations across the country redoing the same thing over and over and over. The problem with this tool, they sometimes will say that it's a racist tool, but really it was just a white guy in Canada that came up with it, and he just didn't know. He didn't know better. And now we're trying to come up with a better tool, but we're not doing it any differently. And I don't know about you guys, but like if you do something and a certain outcome happens, and you do something and a certain outcome happens, and you do that thing again and you expect a different outcome, that seems really weird. So I just think we're going to get 350 really bad tools. So that's one thing I'm trying to work on is getting that together where we can assess, and then we can do this in a way that is beneficial to people, not traumatizing, and takes marginalized populations into account. So one of the things that I did is I decided to build a dashboard that would kind of highlight racial inequity in communities, because we have this data already. And I was like, why can't we examine this and see what we find out? But then can I also automate that? And so what I decided to do was build what I call the Racial Equity and Inclusion Dashboard. I am a white guy and I did create it, but I have been hiring diversity consultants, and I'm working with people in the industry to make sure that I don't make the same mistakes that other people make. So I'm making sure that there's equity in it, there's inclusion, and that it's having other people at the table just besides myself trying to make this thing. So this is how it starts to look. What it does is the Racial Equity Dashboard will take two populations and compare them side by side, with the middle population being kind of your control. That's everybody, that's all populations. So on the left side you can choose a race, on the right side you can choose a race, and then down the dashboard you'll be able to compare them through different measurements. The first visualization we're looking at right now is just total people. There's nothing real special about it, but it allows us to kind of get a baseline of how many people are, and then what we can expect from there. So the next step is I began to break things down by race, but also overlapping the data. So what we're seeing here, the yellow is the white, and then red would be black, African American, African. And this is showing the inflow into the system. And you can already see that there's differences. There are a lot more white people entering the system at one point, and then it actually gets overlapped by black, African American, African, and then switches back. That's a data point I would love to see. I would love to dig in and talk to this organization specifically. Actually, I will be, and then find out what happened here, what's going on. Is this something we should be concerned about? Is this minor? Is it major? But it's a tip, and the great thing is we can hover over this and we can find out what month this happened, and we can start really digging down. So I like to kind of cover what a rate is. I mean, I'm sure everybody knows what a rate is, but it kind of helps to understand that when you compare rates, understanding population size is also extremely important. So in this example, I take 1,000 people, and you look at 100 identifying as black, African American, African, 900 as identifying as white. And then if you have 50 people in that black, African American, African category, and 100 people in the white category, you might be like, oh, okay, well there's twice as many in the one category than the other. And the thing is, when you start dealing with rates, that can be a little interesting because, for example, if you look at the rate of the white category experienced homelessness, if say it's 50 out of 100, that's a 50% rate. But if you have people in the black African American category experiencing homelessness out of 100 to 90, that's a 0.11% rate. So rates can look a lot different, and the population sizes can really factor in. So what's important is to, when you're using rates, to make sure you're also taking the population sizes into account. And I did this using what's called a z-test analysis. So I won't dig too far into the weeds with this, but the point is I can do a lot of this stuff maybe on my own, sitting behind my desk, working with a community's data. What I wanted to do was build this so that the dashboard does the work for the community and they don't need me in the mix all the time. So I built this little indicator. It's hard to see up there, but it's a little red triangle with an exclamation point. And if the rates show a disparity between the races, it lights up red. And then when the disparity disappears because of either the data or because of changing the races, the indicator light goes off. So I try to make this as dead simple for communities as possible. I did this for, let's see, what was that? So the homeless rate, chronic rate, veteran rate. So all the things I showed you before that we kind of measure as a COC, or we measure as organizations for homelessness, I took that a step farther and started looking at the comparison of the rates and using the z-test statistical analysis to see whether they were significant enough that they should be investigated. And they should be. Big shock. So this, again, going through all the vulnerable populations we looked at, veterans, children, etc. And then also the dashboard starts to break things down with trend lines and graphs. For example, housing. We're looking here at a couple of different populations, and there's a gap. Generally, obviously, a gap means that something is different, something is, there's a disparity that should probably be looked into. And again, remember I said using different types of visualizations are helpful? So the one before we saw before was like an area chart. This is kind of like a, I don't know what this is called, but it's got the circles. It's a circle chart now. But what it does is it shows you gaps. And we can break things down by project type. And this is how the investigative process really begins. You start to just look at things at different angles. For example, the project type, return rate. And as you start to kind of look at some of these different pieces, they start making sense. So in homelessness specifically, we have what are called exit destinations. So people might go to an apartment where they pay for it on their own. They might go to housing subsidy, or they may end up going to stay with mom or going to stay with their brother or friends or family or whatever. And what we actually see happen a lot of times is in our measurements, one of the things we look at is that permanent placement to housing. And when you see a high rate of placement to housing, we generally think that's a good thing. And going back here, if we want to look at this chart, what we're seeing is that top race that's having a higher rate to housing, that's actually the category that's Black, African American, and African. That's that category. So they actually, that subpopulation actually has a higher rate of success going to housing placement for this community, which, you know, it could happen, but it did surprise me a little bit. So digging down a little further, I realized that these people that were going to these permanent housing destinations were actually returning back to homelessness at a much higher rate than their other category counterparts. So what was happening was people weren't supposedly going to these positive destinations, and the specific one they were going to all of the time was staying or living with family permanent tenure. The reason why is that's not really tracked. That's a positive destination that nobody really follows up on necessarily. So by digging through the data, we were able to kind of find out that people, I don't know that, I haven't looked at enough to know that people are lying or it's a misunderstanding or a lack of training. I don't know yet, but we have a really good area to investigate now. And this is what I'll be doing with the community in Chattanooga to find out what's going on here. And because of the dashboards that we have, we're gonna be able to dig down, not just a project level, but the actual organizations that are doing this. So I'll be able to filter this down by maybe one agency, and then if this disparity goes away, maybe it's the third agency on the list, but once we find that agency, we can start to talk to them and find out, why this data is being so skewed and why there is an equity, a disparity going on and how to get to equity with this. But it's investigation, and it's building a dashboard that kind of walks people through these steps that I'm working to do. So, what can local organizations do? Kind of going back to the beginning, you can review and get to know data and business processes at the ground level. You can turn data into information that can be easily digested by management and outsiders. You can determine either broadly applied metrics in the industry or create custom metrics. Know where the needle is and how to move it. This is something that I found that was very kind of freeing. When I started working for myself, I was like, well, here are the metrics that everybody else looks at. And then these are kind of the specifications, these are what people expect. But because I have the data and I've got a little bit of training, maybe I want to look at a different metric. Maybe I don't like their metric. I like this metric better. And that's the beauty of kind of understanding some of these basic processes, is you can start coming up with your own ways to measure and your own understanding, and then really you can start pushing the needle truly forward. Never make assumptions. Double and triple check data, conclusions, strategies, etc. Again, don't just assume that one form is going to get from point A to point B, a simple process, and it's going to take 5 minutes. I mean, sometimes I will look at some of these simple processes that were not so simple, and you can make one little change and take off days of a process. So just make sure you're asking all the questions. Don't just assume, oh, form got from point A to point B, because that's not always as simple as it sounds. Having no plan is always a terrible plan. So just think ahead a little bit. And it doesn't have to be, I think sometimes we get bogged down by thinking we've got a plan every step. I like to start with a goal or a metric, and then just kind of take baby steps on the way there, but you should have at least some kind of plan, a vision, a mission, or whatever, but just kind of think about the steps you're gonna need to get where you want your organization to go. Make your data as transparent and openly available as possible. You may not have time to go through all your data, but somebody else might. I know that might be scary because we don't necessarily want people going through our data, but yeah, you do. Because if they find a problem, that's how you fix the problem. Burying the problem or hiding the problem, that's how you get bit later. So I know it can be embarrassing, or it can be, I don't want to do the work right now, but you want to uncover those things. So whether it's you doing it yourself or putting the data out there, you really want to uncover all the problems you can. And generally, the more eyes you have on something, the more things you're going to find out about it that need to be improved, or you're going to get different ideas. I think sometimes we get caught up in our own head going, oh, I'm the only person that can examine this, but it's amazing the insights I get just from talking to somebody else and going, oh, I never thought of that. So make your data available, and it's amazing what people will do with it. Measure twice, cut once. Before you send an email, before you send out a report, just read through it. Double check that graph, double check those numbers to make sense. My old CEO, that's one thing she hammered into my head, and I do appreciate it, because I would hand a piece of paper on her desk, and she'd go, really? Really? Those numbers make sense? No, they don't. I'll be back. And I'd come back and the numbers would make sense. But there'd just be a simple thing, But I appreciate it, and now I do. I double check everything I send out, and it helps me a ton. So going back to broader homeless solutions. So this is something that I like to bring up, because I think a lot of times we get frustrated. I think, I mean, there's homelessness everywhere, you know, whether you work in the field of the industry or not, or I'm sure, you know, we're all touched by it some way, or there's always people around us experiencing it. And all communities want to solve it, but why haven't all the communities solved it? You know, it's really interesting that, you know, we have so much money in this country, we have so many resources, and yet so many of us work so hard, and, you know, and some of these simple things, or that seem simple, like, you know, Charlotte County, Florida, where I'm at, it's not like we're talking millions of people that are homeless, you know, it's like a few hundred. Like, there's a lot of money in that county, why can't we fix this very simple problem? But if you start thinking about, like, maybe it would cost an X amount of money, not necessarily Charlotte County, but anywhere, let's just toss a number out. Let's say homelessness in the community to solve is $100 million. And then the agencies go, all right, cool, $100 million, we're gonna solve homelessness. And then the city, the county, the local government, the funding agency, the federal government, whoever, gives them like $10,000 or $100,000, whatever, that's woefully insignificant compared to the actual number. And then, you know, the agency's like, but what? And then they start working with what limited money they have, and we're arguing about it because there's so many agencies in a community that they can't get to all that money because there's not all that money, and it ends up being gone faster than anyone can blink. And so the point is, a lot of times we want to solve homelessness. Other people don't want to see homeless people, or they don't want to have to be interrupted or bothered or things like that. And the price of harassing somebody and trespassing somebody and hiding them is a lot cheaper than housing and helping them. So when you have a discussion with your community about homelessness, make sure that they're really on the same page and they're really wanting to actually commit those resources and not just trying to hide people, because that's what I think a lot of communities are trying to do. And it's hard because there are people that do care, and it's tough when you're making that assumption that the other person cares as much as you do, or they're willing to give as much as you are, or use the resources that they have when sometimes they're not. So making sure you're on the same page can go a long way. It's been shown that housing a person experiencing chronic homelessness saves a community many times over what it costs to incarcerate, hospitalize, and harass them. Sometimes this takes some convincing and educating local officials, but it's cheaper. It's more, I mean, if you're talking about this from like a sheer profit or you know, I mean, it makes more sense. It really does on a fundamental level to actually, you know, do the big lift up front and then not have the problem continuously happening throughout the history. So it might take those resources initially, but it's really worth it in the long run, and it's going to save the community. Preference. This goes back to cowboy and quarterback. Don't be surprised if somebody won't give up their partner, their pets, or their freedom just to live in a one-bedroom apartment with no AC and a terrible landlord and neighbors. I mean, we have people try to like do a shed. People try to put people in sheds and say that's a house, or on a lanai. But you know, we have to be able to let people have dignity. And sometimes it is. Maybe they just have a dog that they don't want to give up. But would you? You know, I mean, so, and we make some of these rules where it's like they have to get up at, you know, a certain time in the morning, or they have to blah, blah, blah. It's like sometimes, you know, just preference is nice, and being able to be a person is really nice. It's a lot easier to get a job or to maintain things when you can take a shower, when you can actually get a good night's rest. I mean, there's a lot of benefits to that. And this kind of goes down to the end. Treat people like people and be kind. And I think this happens. I think this should be everywhere. I think it should be in this room where we're all kind of on the same level. I think if it's the President of the United States, or it's a person that's, you know, the Walmart greeter or whoever. I mean, we're all just people. We're all cool, and you know, we can all just hang out, talk, and really work through a lot of these problems. If we just kind of get off our high horses and realize that we're people, we're all kind of in here together, and we're all, you know, working for common good. At least I think most of us are, really. And then this is where I'm going to stop just for a brief moment before I hand it over to Amanda to see if anybody has any questions real quick, just about the stuff that I've talked about briefly. And then we'll do it again. Yeah.
So I'm curious, you have race up there, but what are the other demographics are you looking at? Like ethnicity, zip codes, so on and so forth?
Yeah, that's a great question. So with HUD specifications, we actually have race and ethnicity broken out separately, but we can put them back together, and we can do different kind of manipulations on it. So we're not necessarily stuck with just one way of doing it. But we do, I mean, there's lots of different ways we look at the populations. I showed some of them up there, but yeah, race and demographic are the main things, but we're still working on it. I want to be honest with you, HUD's still working on it a lot. It's messy. Yeah.
So
Yes and no, because what's interesting, like say for example, if you look at, because the way we can do it right now is we can look at, different categories of races. So we can look at Black, African American, we can look at white, we can look at Asian American, etc. And then separately ethnicity. But when we work on the data ourselves, we can actually look at, not just white Hispanic, but African American Hispanic, and other categories and ethnicities. So we're not just completely locked into those known places. And the great thing too, like San Diego and some of these other, very diverse communities, having the ability to not just be stuck in a way of looking at race and ethnicity is really nice. To be able to look at the ethnicity of other races and have ethnicity mixed in and taken out. There's just different ways to kind of examine the data so that you can look at it from different angles. I was trying to kind of delay a little bit, but I think I'm done for now. We're going to go to Amanda, and then we're going to do some questions and answers after that.
Thanks, Gaither. I will tell you guys, Gaither and I have worked together and known each other for a while, and his work with data in the homelessness space has done a lot to elevate understanding of homelessness in Florida. Honestly, before Gaither came on the scene, there was not much visualization done at all or analytics done for homeless services in Florida. And so he kind of introduced us to a whole new way of doing this. At the same time, HUD also looked at some consistent system performance measures. And so all COCs and homeless service providers are driven by data now. And so that's a big change that you don't think about a lot in human services sometimes. To make all of this work, collaboration is key. So, Gaither brought up a great point. It is important to have other people pick your data apart. We want people from different perspectives and walks of life to do that. And sometimes you have to present the data in a way that it can be understood, digested, and regurgitated by somebody who has never interfaced with this data before. And so through some of the visualizations, he's kind of demonstrated what you can do. I'm gonna get in the nitty-gritty part and talk a little bit about the relationship part, how you make some collaborations work. Of course, with sharing data, there's some messy parts and you have to work out releases of information. There are certain ways to share data that are easier. And so I'll give you some ideas from, where there's a will, there's a way. So, as simple as comparing two spreadsheets or actually having systems talk to each other. Because it doesn't matter where you are, you can start using your data and working with somebody else to find something out that's new to improve what you offer. So my experience really is with nonprofit services of various sorts. So the entities that I've worked with over the years, I'll speak to my experiences and how we work together on data, but you guys also might have some things that you've done locally that would benefit people in the room. So I'm gonna give you some time to kind of bring that up if it comes to mind. So managing entities, there's 7 of them in Florida. Florida is one of the only states that's really structured like this, but managing entities are state-funded organizations that cover behavioral health services for people who are uninsured. And they run a massive database, tracking services, fees, diagnoses, all kinds of stuff on these individuals. COCs often interact with the same individuals, being uninsured. We talk, kind of largely about there being an overlap there. I'll give you an example of how a COC collaborated with a managing entity to see exactly how much of a crossover there was. And that was simply done with 2 Excel spreadsheets. So it doesn't have to be fancy. County jails. A lot of the information that they collect in the beginning really doesn't identify why that person has come to the jail. So they don't often ask about housing. So you can work together to make sure places are asking the right questions that will then help you understand the bigger picture later. One of the county jails that I worked with, I found out they did not have any questions about where somebody was staying before they came to the jail, where they planned to go, or if they had enough income or natural supports to keep them in housing. So a simple change with them asking that question on the intake allowed the COC to better partnership with the discharge planning and understanding kind of how many people were falling into that system. Local government, guys, I tapped a resource, and probably many of you guys know how proficient local governments are at data. But we really did not have resources in the COC I was in for data analytics at the time. And I kept asking these questions, people kept asking me questions from the community, as well as the county and city commissions about homelessness. And I wasn't afraid to say I didn't know. I said, I don't know. I said, I need your staff to help me figure this out. So they, essentially gave me like on call a GIS person and a Tableau person. And, we would ask the questions, but they would figure out how to put it together. And so I'll show you a specific example of that. If you were in the earlier session today, it was downstairs. It was maximizing federal resources. There were a couple of dashboards shared. I'll get into the nitty-gritty about how that worked. Healthcare organizations are tricky to collaborate with because there is some health information and releases of information that need to be addressed. But I'll tell you, if you're on the homeless service side, you're likely integrated into coordinated entry. And so this is where a bunch of information is collected at the beginning of meeting with somebody, and you understand kind of what's going on with them so that you can use that information to help find them resources. Well, if you do it right, you can have a release of information where you can use that client's information to coordinate with other services. So it is really easy for the COC to provide names, information about people to another entity like a healthcare organization who has a lot of resources, and then they can kind of do the analytics on their side and give it back to you. They're not going to give you their client information or patient information, so you kind of have to find a way to work that. Do you guys have any other ideas about how you've collaborated? If you have an example of working with a university or higher education, please share that. Anybody have any examples? You can just shout it out.
I'm gonna call out Audrey because she could talk about her relationship with University of Miami and doing the youth count, but also we have collaborated with HMOs that have looked at data. They've proven that clients in their HMO plan that are homeless have basically reduced significantly their hospitalization rates. So that's a good example. I just wish that beyond just sharing data and getting to the point where you prove that they did something about it and said, here's some money, let's collaborate on doing a development, we'll provide the support services. But yeah, that's a great example of how to share data. Audrey, you want to talk about University of Miami and the youth count and how you guys share data, or?
Not really.
Okay.
Yeah, we work with UM each year. We pay them, we subcontract them to help us out with data and collecting data around youth histories of homelessness. So we usually work out right after the homeless trust does theirs for the general population, and we ask youth-specific questions, and we have young leaders that actually go out to the community with our partner organizations to survey youth, and UM cleans up all the data, makes it look pretty, and it helps us figure out what are the strategies that we need to do to address youth homelessness in Miami County. Thanks, man.
Thank you.
Go ahead. Yeah.
So we did, we formed a collaboration. I had a CFO from a local hospital on my board, and we took a sample of, because I work in the homeless service arena, and we took a sample of clients, gave them, their names and so forth, and had them be measured with entrance or basically visits to our local hospitals. And we were able to use that data also saw a significant decrease by housing these individuals and could prove that data, because I love data, but I'm not a data person, I'm a people person, so it's like, okay, how do we do this? Well, we were able to formulate and look and show the savings to our local hospitals of a couple $2 million by, of course, housing an individual is cost less than going through the system through the different entities. And we paired that with United Way money, and we were able to use that to leverage and increase our collaborative money. So it really helps, and sometimes it's just really simple with just going to your local, healthcare or your jails and looking at that information and finding and seeing that. And it's just amazing to see some of the simple data. You don't have to get really intricate into the details, but it can really prove your case and leverage those dollars.
Yeah, those are excellent examples. And what comes out of that is, especially with proving cost savings, even if you don't know how this is going to help your system or help the clients you set out to help, if you start talking about it, once you know that data, if you start talking about it at commission meetings, just in the community with other organizations, with philanthropists locally, with the faith-based community, then you're not necessarily asking them to help you, but when there's something so stark in front of them, they will volunteer to help, surprisingly. It's kind of amazing. You do have to be succinct, you do have to make it simplified, and visualizations are the way to do that. Leaving them with something that they can understand and regurgitate to somebody else to help educate people about what you need is really important. Those are great examples, guys. So we have talked a little bit about coordinated entry in here. Gaither mentioned the BI-SPDAT. That's an assessment that a lot of organizations use with their coordinated entry process to assess for certain things. You don't have to have a ton of information on somebody, and you don't have to share a ton of information on somebody to figure out if there's an overlap in a population across systems. So I'll give you an example of a project where the managing entity, the agency who was covering behavioral health services for people with uninsured, and the COC essentially said, we need your help covering housing costs for some of these clients who have higher behavioral health needs. What are we looking at? How much of our population actually overlaps? So what that took was something very simple, and this was a few years ago, so this was probably 2017 or so. We've come a long way in the data world and how we compare and analyze data. But at this point, it was just a couple of people who really wanted to figure this out. And so essentially, this continuum of care took their coordinated entry list, which is prioritized for people based on their need level. And so they looked at the section of their coordinated entry list with all of the clients who needed the most amount of support services and the highest housing subsidies. So those of you familiar with homeless services, this was the crowd that needed permanent supported housing. And so on the BI-SPDAT, they were scoring 15, 14, highest you can go. They produced a list. It included the client's first and last name, social security number, date of birth, and that's it. They had permission from all of those clients to do that because of the way they set up their release of information. So when they collected the information at the beginning, they asked if it was okay if they share these information points with another entity for this exact purpose. And the client had a choice, yes or no. I want to share or don't. And so everybody participating in coordinated entry didn't have to share their information to be served or to be helped, but these people did. So that list, just an Excel sheet of information, password protected, of course, went to the managing entity. And they had a completely different data system, so there wasn't really a good way without a lot of financial resources to bounce that information off of each other to figure out the crossover. So, entry-level staff went through the managing entity database, looking up each individual client. At the end of that, I think it took a few hours, You know, the length of the list wasn't overwhelming. 70% of that list of people who needed permanent supportive housing in that COC were also being served by the managing entity. So, right at the same time, the managing entity got some resources for housing to start helping people. And so this is how that COC convinced that managing entity to use that money for housing. You know, we have these clients, we would like you to pay this, this, and this for these clients when it comes up. And so that's how it worked. It was not complicated, it didn't actually take a lot of visualization. Once they heard that 70%, they were in. All right, so another example, this is the one that if you were in the beginning session about maximizing federal resources, you saw Dr. Kimball Thomas share a dashboard for the city of Tallahassee. And so I wanted to kind of talk to you about how that came to be. That all came to be through COVID. In that session, everybody mentioned how they were kind of acquaintances before, the COC, the county, the city, you know, hi, how you doing? They weren't really collaborating. Well, now they text, call every single day. So through the pandemic, these types of entities got really close. Local governments had a lot of funding they needed to spend, and they needed to rely on community partners to do that because they were connected to the population. They understood what the needs were. So, like I said, most COCs, most homeless service providers don't have the resources to have a data analytics person on staff full time. They may partner with a university, something like that for special projects, but they generally do not have the resources to do some of the visualizations. So they were working so closely with the county and the city that they essentially had a person assigned to them just for data to help them understand what was happening with people through the pandemic who were unsheltered at the time. So the main goal of this was just to figure out, were people staying put if they were unsheltered, or were they moving across the city and into other areas? So we used the city's GIS staff, and we used outreach workers on the homeless service side, and we started to kind of keep a list of where people were, and would turn it in kind of weekly, and they would, you know, put it into GIS and show any type of movement. People moved everywhere. Before that, we had the sense that everybody was pretty much staying in set locations like camps or close to a resource like food, but we didn't really know because we didn't do this before. But the sense was that everybody was pretty stationary and staying put. Well, all of the food resources went away. Our faith community wasn't able to serve people because of COVID. So people started moving and trying to find another way, another place in the community where they could get their needs met. And so we used that information to figure out where to stand up services. So if we saw a lot of people going into one area, we knew that we needed to do regular outreach, meals, you know, whatever, showers in that location. So that really helped guide some of that work. What ended up coming from this wasn't just that piece of the pie. We also looked at how much funding was being invested by the county, the city, and the COC. So at the beginning, the COC was funding homeless services for the Leon County, Tallahassee area at about 90% of the pie. And you know, the county and city were contributing very little in financial resources. Well, we ended up going through all of these data points, looking at system improvement, looking at rate of return, and we ended up doing a presentation to the joint city-county work group that was focused on homelessness and housing. And through all of that, they were able to dedicate a lot of the COVID resources to kind of balance out the investment. And so now the COC is funding are actually general revenue dollars that are dedicated to homeless services and housing for homeless. That was done prior to a lot of the infusion of funds for COVID. So it is really using your data to help the community understand their part in owning an issue is really important. Typically in this community, the city had contributed more than the county. Well, you know, it was a little bit shameful when we all got in front of each other in a large group, and that kind of came out, that the county had not contributed specifically to homelessness. So quickly, dollars started flying to address outreach, shelter needs, that kind of stuff. And now that partnership is really strong. On a weekly basis, the COC, the county, and the city could tell you what the highest needs are, how many people are like waiting for this type of service. So it really does take people who are invested and care. And I will say the city of Tallahassee and Leon County, the people who were over their human services and housing departments genuinely cared. So they wanted to figure this out. And so we were lucky to work with some really great staff. And they're continuing to collaborate, going as a group of 3 to leverage other resources, apply for grants that are federal. So they're just expanding their work. So here's an example of some of the information that was shared with the community. We did I know this is really small, you guys will get the slides, and there is a link to this information in the dashboard in detail. But basically we looked at a spectrum from homelessness to home ownership, and we compared the number of people and what is needed as a dollar amount to the resources that were available, or units of housing in some cases, and showed the gap. And that's how we got them to fund permanent supported housing. Some of the other things that were kind of key to this partnership, the city and county had previously invested in a local funding opportunity. And they did fund homeless service providers, but they had no metrics for knowing if their investment was actually a solution to homelessness. And so we encouraged them to adopt the same metrics for these agencies that were funded as the COC used. And so we helped them, come up with how to monitor that, how to do the reporting, that kind of thing. So all of the funding is essentially coordinated, and you're able to see the big impact that way. If you're looking at different things, if you're just looking at counts of people and not rates of housing and retention, you don't really know if your investment is making a difference. This was the beginning of the pandemic without COVID resources and what was dedicated in this community to homeless services. And it was 1.3 million. It was not very much at all. After a meeting where we shared all of this information, the COC walked away with about 7 to 8 million that would go through them to be coordinated as an effort to reduce homelessness. So the data is what they pay attention to. So that's my spiel. We'll open it up for questions for me or Gaither, or anything you want to share about your community and how you kind of leverage data.
Do you have any recommendations for the visualization tools that you use?
I am not the technical person, so.
There are so many, honestly. Tableau is very user-friendly. And if you work for a nonprofit through TechSoup, you get a license for $58. And then what I did, how I learned Tableau, is I went on a site called Udemy, U-D-E-M-Y. There's edX or whatever, and you can take for like $5, you can learn a class in Tableau or lots of different data visualization things. So between those two things, it's amazing what you can do. But there's also Power BI by Microsoft. Amazon has its own. So I would encourage you, if you already have an ecosystem or you already have like Microsoft products, to maybe look at Power BI. Or if you've got Amazon stuff, maybe look at QuickSight. But just look up data visualization tools, and there's so many different flavors that really it's just, you know, whatever you want to mess with. But Tableau I find to be very drag and drop, user friendly. But even Excel does data visualization. Kind of, you know, looks like 90s graphics, but it works.
I wanted to mention one more resource to you guys. The Florida Housing Coalition, we do tons of publications, and we do those based on requests for information across all of our teams. We just published a data publication, and it's about 60 pages, but it gives you a really good overview of best data practices, and it does give you links and access to housing and homelessness information that is just available for the general public that you might not be aware of. And you can filter it by your community. So if you're wanting to look at your specific community, compare units, that would be a good place to kind of use as a reference to get that information. Anybody else have any questions or comments?
What are your thoughts on working with the courts to get like eviction data, for example?
Say the first part again.
Clerk of courts getting the data from the court system to get like eviction data, to, you know, that connection between evictions, homelessness, and affordable housing, right? So like kind of like paint the picture visually of how many people are experiencing evictions and then experiencing homelessness. We've been trying to do that in Miami-Dade County and try.
Yeah.
So wondering if you have any thoughts on other communities that have successfully engaged the court system or you know,
So I would recommend partnering with your legal service organization. They have had the best luck doing it. It is a shame that that is operated county by county and not statewide. The Florida Housing Coalition did a lot of emergency rental assistance, and we were trying to find that information, and the local governments in some instances were non-responsive. They had too much going on. So we couldn't really get a good picture of statewide what that looked like. But in some areas, we were able to rely on the legal services organizations, and they were able to work with their local court to get that information on a regular basis.
I just wanted to offer for those folks that are in the community with children's services councils, there's excellent data resource and part-time.
Yeah, that's a really good point.
I work for a legal services organization, so I kind of wanted to add one of the projects that I'm preparing right now. I'm gonna get some law students to help me go through all of the eviction data. Just to give you an example, in Orange County, evictions are so terrible that you can only search 500 at a time. So I can't do a monthly search because it's gonna show me 500 results. And in reality, we're seeing about 1,500 evictions filed every month. So I'm just gonna get a couple of law students and start going week by week through the eviction numbers. Hopefully, those numbers are less than 500, so we can then sort them and try to figure out addresses, census tract, have a list of who are, like a naughty list of landlords, like who are the landlords that are filing the most evictions, trying to track if they are participating in mental assistance and so on. So legal services organizations are probably their go-to when it comes to that, but as she said, every county has a different system. Sometimes you can't really see everything, so that was such of the challenges that we have.
Another great example of where there's a will, there's a way.
I work for Movie Software. We have about 100 jurisdictions around the country that have emergency rental assistance programs. We've been doing some webinars with the Treasury Department directly, but for those that, whether it's Leader 360 or Yarding, they ask a question about eviction assistance as well as notice and case status information. So if you are able to talk to your city or county, you're usually capturing that data as far as the eviction status of the individual under emergency rental assistance and whether they are a preference or priority. So if you go to your county and ask if they can pull out from their report builder that information, they will have it for individuals that apply for assistance.
And not to put you on the spot, but to put you on the spot. Is there a way, since you're with the software,
Oh, yeah.
If there are entities that are using that, of those 100, where they agree to share, is there a way to make that happen?
Yeah, so I'm working with.
We can't hear her.
Oh, you can't hear me? Okay, I'm sorry. I'm working with multiple jurisdictions. For example, in Florida, we have about 20 jurisdictions who all use our platform. So we feed that information into the state of Florida, and there is a time where all of our clients are getting duplication of benefit search functionality, but jurisdictions such as Baltimore, Alabama, Jefferson County, it's really dependent on the jurisdiction, but we can tie our portals into the data, or we take their historical data so that they can search for duplication of benefits, either from the eviction prevention side or just for tenants that have been assisted. My background is housing authority work. I worked for 12 years with the housing authority, so that's why I'm a dated person as well. But it has been very interesting to see within the last 2 years how these ERA programs are now turning into eviction diversion, because that's where the money is really coming from. I didn't see it.
What software do you have?
Every software.
All right, guys, we're right at 12:01. You may want to sprint to the lunch area to get your spot.